In the winter of 1884, the Cumberland Gap in Kentucky looked like a deep scar on the earth. Through that narrow corridor, the wind blew down like a frozen current. That icy current carried away leaves, soil, and even the dreams of those seeking to live in that place. Nearly everyone had built their houses according to the known methods. They used to install a large fireplace in the center, or on the main wall, in plain sight. That element gave character to the home and kept the fire burning. It was a tradition brought by the Eastern pioneers, a formula no one dared to change. However, that winter, while the houses froze inside, a newly arrived Scotsman named Duncan MacLeod decided to break with tradition. His proposal seemed absurd to everyone. They criticized him as soon as he set the first timber. He had a strange way of looking at the landscape, as if conversing with the hills before deciding anything. While others built wide walls with the fireplace facing forward, he calculated shadows. He also studied the direction of the wind and tapped the floor with a cane to sense its echo. Then, he announced that he would place the fireplace in the northeast corner. The other neighbors couldn't contain their laughter. "Putting a fireplace in a corner will only fill your house with smoke," one said. "The wind will end up putting out the fire," added another. "MacLeod, you're wasting the whole winter," a third declared. He, however, with a serenity that drove everyone crazy, continued the work without justifying himself. Duncan had grown up in the mountains of Scotland, where homes didn't seek aesthetics but rather to withstand gusts capable of tearing off doors and breaking bones. In that environment, he discovered that fire lasts longer where the wind can't reach. He also understood that heat escapes more slowly when warm air moves in a single direction. Deciding to put the fireplace in the corner wasn't a whim for him, but a calculated move. Most settlers used large, heavy fireplaces. Their stone walls absorbed heat and released it too late, when it was already useless. Sure, the fire burned, but the air undid its work in a matter of seconds. The wind battered the house from behind and pushed the heat toward the gaps in the front. A battle doomed to fail from the very first moment. Duncan had noticed that the wind there behaved like a whirlwind. It came in from the north and swept diagonally toward the south. If he placed the fireplace on the side opposite the direct onslaught, he could create a sheltered space. In that way, the draft would remain steady, and heat wouldn't escape, as if the house exhaled with every gust of wind. If you enjoy this content, subscribe to the channel. The house he was building seemed strange to the whole camp. While others raised high ceilings to let the smoke circulate, Duncan kept his much lower. It didn't feel confining, but it was just the right height to hold in the heat. He insulated the walls using a mixture of clay, fibrous plants, and small stones. Once dry, those layers became a defense that blocked the passage of air much better than any poorly fitted log. But the most striking thing was the connection between the fireplace and the floor. Almost all the camp's fireplaces rested directly on the ground and absorbed cold with no way to stop it. Duncan also dug a hole and placed a layer of packed earth, old ashes, and finely ground stone there. In this way, he formed a base that retained heat and prevented cold from creeping up. On top, he laid the stone foundation. As a final detail, he added a narrow, funnel-shaped duct so the smoke would rise slowly without taking too much air from the room. The camp people kept joking, especially because his chimney didn't seem to have any axis or measurement. "It looks like you left it where it fell," they mocked. "No matter how you look at it, it's a badly done job." However, while the rest of the houses creaked from drafts and let smoke out through the cracks, MacLeod's home remained silent. You couldn't hear that typical whistle that reveals heat loss. And with the first big snowfall, the advantages of his design began to show. The wind battered the homes furiously, rattled the rooftops, and forced its icy breath through every crack. Every few hours, the men would wake to rekindle the embers. Even so, by daybreak, the temperature inside the dwellings barely reached 5 or 6 degrees. Some watched ice form in the corners of the window panes, and more than one found their bucket of water nearly frozen. Duncan's dwelling, however, told a different story. His home, tucked into a corner, sheltered the fire from drafts. The flame danced slowly and steadily, barely feeling the pull of the wind. The heat gathered in that nook, climbed up the wall, slid across the ceiling, and then descended in a gentle circuit that wrapped the room in a pleasant warmth. While outside, The thermometer dropped to -10. Inside his house, the cold could not settle in. The mercury held steady at around 15 or 16 degrees. Such an astonishing gap that it seemed incomprehensible without knowing the secret. Soon the neighbors began to believe he burned more firewood. The reality was exactly the opposite. They threw log after log onto the fire, while he only fed it every 2 hours. The secret lay not in stoking the blaze more fiercely, but in how the dwelling stored and distributed that heat. The gale that stripped heat from the other huts slammed against the opposite side of Duncan's and rose up outside, never slipping in. One morning of extreme cold, Miller, accompanied by 2 other settlers, went to Duncan's house to verify the rumor. Not only was it toasty warm, his cabin registered a 22-degree difference from the outside. As the door opened, a gentle gust of warm air met their faces, caressing them. That heat was not stifling and did not smell of smoke. There was no stuffiness or dampness, but rather a homogeneous warmth, carefully distributed. Something as rare in Cumberland Gap as lightning in a clear sky. Miller, incredulous, asked, "How did you do it?" Duncan shrugged and, with subtle sarcasm, replied, "I placed it where the wind has no authority." No one yet imagined that that fireplace, which everyone had dismissed as absurd, was actually a stroke of genius. That hearth was going to revolutionize, from that very winter onward, the way the settlers built their houses. November continued its course without haste, but without mercy, and soon 2 kinds of dwellings could be seen in Cumberland Gap. The first seemed to maintain a constant battle against the cold. The second was that strange little cabin in which, according to common talk, winter lost its fierceness. The rest of the settlers raised their chimneys straight, haughty, against the facade as custom dictated. Duncan, however, kept at his corner, laying stone after stone with a deliberate slowness that drove any onlooker to despair. Not only had he chosen a spot they considered absurd, but he had also decided to make it larger than necessary. The stone foundation embedded itself in the 2 adjoining walls and spread its solid bulk, as if trying to embrace the house from within. Samuel Wright, the settlement's master architect, watched with curiosity tinged with disdain. In his view, this wasted space and labor. By bringing the chimney into the corner, Duncan took away usable square footage from the interior of the dwelling. And as if that were not enough, he used an amount of stone that no reasonable man would have agreed to. Tom Bradley, the region's most prestigious builder, went even further in his criticism. He maintained that the hearth had to rest on a real wall, not hang in some strange corner. It looked like the work of someone who had started building and then pulled back before finishing. Duncan, in contrast, mastered a mystery none of them had considered. Heat ignores symmetry and beauty. It only understands surfaces and paths. If he placed the fire in the corner, it would heat not 1 wall, but 2 at the same time. And those 2 stone walls, filled with heat, would become a huge radiator. Even when the flames had already died down and only embers remained, he kept mulling over his work. In his mind, he wasn't just building a simple chimney. What he was doing was hiding a heat accumulator in the heart of the cabin. The other settlers finished their chimney in a couple of days. Duncan, however, needed almost 14 days to consider his complete. He walked along the stream, carefully choosing each block. He wanted dense, heavy stones whose texture would confirm they would retain heat for many hours. He placed each piece so that most of that mass of rock was embedded half a meter into the side walls. In this way, he formed a compact core, integrated with the rest of the construction. The flames, instead of striking against a single wall, would bathe that stone from within, filling it with heat from the base up to near the ceiling. By the time Duncan finished his chimney, the settlers had stopped thinking about designs and only talked about firewood. They had piled up logs, checked the roofs, sealed cracks their own way. For them, the essential thing was not running out of fuel, not how to make the most of it. He didn't waste time arguing with anyone. Even if they called him crazy, he remembered the winters in Scotland, where his parents, with very little firewood, managed to keep the house warm thanks to thick walls and a well-placed chimney. He was clear that the secret was not in feeding a great fire, but in making a small fire yield as much as possible. December arrived as sharp as a razor. The first hard frosts served as a warning. It soon became clear who had acted out of inertia and who had taken the trouble to think things through. At the Wrights' house, the scene repeated every night. Around the fire, A circle formed that burned so intensely you had to lean back to avoid getting burned. In the farthest corners, the cold was biting, and even inside the house you could see your breath when speaking. Something similar happened at Bradley's. One corner unbearably hot, and another where water would freeze if you left it overnight. In those homes, the fire was more of a nuisance than a help. The whole family had to huddle around it and couldn't make good use of the rest of the house. In Duncan's cabin, by contrast, the scene was very different. The fire didn't put on a violent show. It behaved like a calm companion. The flame was lively, without needing to be gigantic. The heat it gave off didn't escape up the flue or stay trapped around the fire. The heat struck against the stone in that corner and slowly charged it. That same stone turned into an invisible reservoir, released heat steadily throughout the night. Sometimes Duncan let the fire die several hours before going to bed and reduced it to embers. When the others, frozen, got up at dawn to revive their chimney, he would put his hand on the wall and find it still warm. In the house next door, outside temperatures could reach 15 or 20 degrees below zero. Inside, it barely rose above freezing, and only at the cost of burning firewood without measure. In Duncan's, the thermometer could register more than 20 degrees difference from the outside, and it maintained a temperature of 20 to 22 degrees with hardly any effort. If you're enjoying the video, subscribe. And what surprised visitors most was not just the warmth of his cabin, but the way it was distributed. There were no cozy corners only by the fire, nor icy corners among the shadows. No matter where you chose to sit in the room, the temperature was similar, without sudden changes. That annoyance of having a hot face and a frozen back, which many already took as inevitable, was nowhere to be found. That balance didn't happen by chance. It came from where the chimney was built and from how the air circulated inside. As it burned in the corner, the fire created a circular flow of warm air that climbed up the rocky wall, crossed the low ceiling, and ended on the opposite side of the dwelling. Then, as it lost heat, the air slowly descended back to the fireplace. It wasn't an intense draft that caused chills, but rather a quiet circuit that kept the heat from stagnating in one place. The other dwellings, for their part, suffered a serious problem. The heat concentrated near the stove and rushed upward, vanishing up the chimney flue. The rest of the room was almost untouched by the heating system. By mid-December, the first serious comparisons came. It was freezing so much that everyone had to calculate their remaining firewood reserves and how much they had already burned. Wright noticed with unease that in a few weeks he had consumed nearly half of his firewood, and his family still had to sleep covered with several layers of clothing and blankets to withstand the cold. When they told him about Duncan's dwelling, he decided to check it personally. It wasn't mere curiosity, but a real urgency. As he crossed the doorway, the difference struck him like a friendly but undeniable slap. He came from a place where cold could seep through any crack. There, instead, he found himself in a room where not even his breath formed vapor when he exhaled. In that place, hands didn't go numb, and children could have played on the floor without fear of the cold stiffening them. He placed his palm on the stone wall, 1.5 meters from the fire, and found it warm. It seemed as if a hidden sun were radiating from behind the rock. His mind quickly did the math. Could Duncan's corner fireplace maintain that warmth with less wood? This meant that if he had built his house with a different layout, the effort spent felling, stacking, and hauling logs would have been reduced by nearly half. What he previously saw as a waste of walls and spaces was beginning to look like a profitable plan. Nevertheless, each of them bore a trace of wounded pride. Admitting that the seemingly misplaced fireplace of a newly arrived Scot performed better than their own was a bitter pill to swallow. Supposing that amounted to acknowledging that decades of experience, family traditions, and frontier wisdom weren't enough against a small detail everyone had ignored. In which corner do you place the fire, and what do you do to keep it with you, instead of unintentionally casting it away? But none of them yet imagined that the real test of this wouldn't be a single freezing night. The trial by fire would come with a terrible stretch of nearly a month of relentless temperatures, ready to slam down on Cumberland Gap. That period would mercilessly show which shelters were well-equipped and which had merely imitated old customs, trusting that such routine would be enough. Then, a winter of colossal violence shook Cumberland Gap without warning. Toward the last days of December, a mass of frigid air descended from the mountains in gusts, and turned the valley into a passage of unbearable wind. In that place, the cold didn't just fall from the sky. It seemed to rise from the ground itself. For almost a month, outdoor thermometers hovered around 20 degrees below zero. The harshest nights reached levels capable of causing logs to crack and numbing fingers until the skin split if left exposed for too long. That season became a rigorous test for the village's buildings. Its results confirmed what few wanted to accept. Duncan MacLeod's approach wasn't a personal whim, but a quiet advantage. The classic-style dwellings, whose hearths were located in the center or near the main facade, soon showed signs of thermal exhaustion. In more than one, the clay in the joints cracked due to the expansion and contraction caused by the incoming cold. Added to that strain was the fluctuating heat inside. In other cabins, frost accumulated in the corners until the inhabitants ended up scraping ice off the walls. It seemed they lived in an icebox. No matter how much they fed the stoves with logs, the breeze always managed to sneak in through some crack. It penetrated every corner of the place, stealing heat the moment it tried to stay. Inside those dwellings, the atmosphere took on an almost theatrical tone. Around the fire, a blazing circle made it impossible to endure more than a few minutes without sweating. Beyond it, the shadows turned icy. On the opposite side of the cabin, the buckets would be covered in a thin layer of ice by morning. Despite the fire kept burning all night, the children slept with their boots on and wrapped in several blankets, but woke up with numb fingers. The families took turns reviving the embers, exhausted from spending entire sleepless nights. If the flame went out, the freezing air devoured the house within minutes. Duncan's cabin, in contrast, showed a stability so strange it was unsettling. The corner where he had placed his fireplace pulsed like a heart radiating heat. It beat calmly and gave off a steady warmth that spread through the home in gentle waves. The great stone, which the fire had charged for hours, released its energy slowly. Even when Duncan let the flames die down to embers, the interior remained mild. On the harshest nights, the other houses swung from stifling heat by the fire to nearly polar cold in the corners. His, however, stayed steady and serene, around 20 degrees, even when the outside registered temperatures of a winter that gave no quarter. The real secret lay in the air circulation inside the dwelling. For most, that logic was so invisible that they couldn't understand it even by observing it. Since the fireplace stood in a corner sheltered from the prevailing wind, the draft didn't catch the flame violently. Instead of letting the hot air escape through the flue, the house retained almost all the heat, releasing only what was needed to prevent smoke from building up. The air rose along the stone walls, traveled across the low ceiling, and gently pushed the heat toward the center of the room, then spiraled down the opposite wall, warmed up a little, and returned somewhat cooler but still valuable to the fire corner. That cycle created a constant movement that warmed the space without uncomfortable drafts, without dead corners or unbearable extremes. It was an imperceptible, almost perfect dance among walls, ceiling, and floor. When the most violent storm of the winter finally arrived, the gusts were so strong that some roofs lifted several centimeters. From then on, the contrast between the houses was beyond any doubt. In a single night, 2 cabins lost part of the insulation in their walls. A third saw the base of its chimney crack, on the verge of starting a fire. That night, terrified by the wind and ice, several settlers crossed the deep snow to Duncan's house. They were seeking refuge, not knowing whether he would take them in or whether his cabin could hold them all. When they pushed open the door, what they saw left them speechless. The room was warm, free of smoke, with no cracks in the walls, and without the smell of wet firewood that had become usual for them. The fire burned placidly, without roars or sparks, as if it knew there was nothing to defend against. The chimney stone gave off such a gentle heat that several men, incredulous, came over to touch it. No one understood how the cabin could remain so stable after hours of such savage wind. Duncan, with his eternal serenity, made room for them and invited them to sit down. He explained that the trick wasn't in stoking the fire more or building thicker walls, but in understanding where the wind blows from. He also revealed to them how air moves in a space and how you can make the heat stay. He told them they shouldn't let the heat escape every time the outside overpowered it. He spoke to them about the diagonal wind of Cumberland Gap and how poorly oriented houses end up creating their own enemy. The heat escapes them using the same logic with which they try to retain it. Without boasting, he told them that in Scotland he had learned to place the fire in a spot where the wind couldn't steal it. He also took the opportunity to tell them that in cold valleys, the key was to ally with the climate, never fight against it. The settlers listened without saying a word. Some felt humiliated. Others were so exhausted they barely had the strength to reply. But that night, each and every one understood what they had ignored for so many years. Habit is not a rule, and repeating the usual does not ensure survival. After the storm, in the following days, some men began to take apart their chimneys piece by piece. They tried to imitate Duncan's angle, its volume of rock, the depth of the hearth, and even the orientation of the house. They didn't achieve perfect results, because a structure designed from the start always surpasses one that's forced into shape. Even so, the indoor heat increased noticeably. It was then, for the first time since arriving at Cumberland Gap, that they understood the chimney is not a simple stove for cooking or warming themselves. It is the engine that drives the heat of the whole house. That component, used properly, can turn an icy house into a solid refuge. The winter lasted longer than expected, but when it finally ended, the whole camp remembered one thing. Duncan Macutia's cabin had held out with a 22-degree advantage over the others. He achieved it without burning too much wood, without cracks, and without sleepless nights. That choice, initially judged absurd, eventually established itself as the new standard. It became the ideal model for anyone who wanted to survive without stacking huge amounts of fuel or relying on luck. Over the years, many of those settlers would tell the story of the Scotsman who placed his chimney in a corner. With his way of reasoning, he stood up to an entire valley. Some would attribute almost mystical powers to him. Others would remember him as a peculiar man who preferred to use his head rather than copy. But all would agree that his cabin was not only warmer, but also left a valuable lesson about life on the frontier. Nature does not favor the strongest or the most stubborn. It favors those who understand its rhythms, those who observe before acting, those who know that a warm home is not achieved by shouting for the fire to burn. It is achieved by building a shelter where the wind does not set the rules. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe.